Good afternoon from Auckland and from down in Wellington. Welcome to the ETNZ online session for storytelling, creating visitor experience and exhibitions. Small amount of housekeeping before we get underway. Please feel free to pop any questions into the chat area or the Q&A area, and I'll pass those on to Mark as necessary. And there'll be a little bit of an announcement towards the end of that, but don't forget to get your trade show passport all sorted out from visiting the suppliers on the trade show passport, so you get the chance to go into the draw for the suite of fantastic prizes that have been made available. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague, Marc Simpson. So Marc, for those of you who don't know him, Marc originated from theatre and electrical services, winning many awards and being involved in many productions is sort of background. Over 30 years ago, Marc started the journey with Tlaus, originally as Marc Simpson Lighting Limited. Some changes back in 2006 indicated a shift to not just purely being focused in lighting design, but a delivery of broader services, skill sets and ideas, notably things like audio-visual consultancy, placemaking, lighting design, project management, and most notably, innovative lighting solutions for visitor experience centres. Now, if you've been to, some of these installations around New Zealand, the Tipuia one sticks out a lot in Rotorua. You'll be able to see the work that Marc has done with his talented team in those areas. And with the result today that Toulouse, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Thanks, Mike. They now sit at the forefront of this relatively young industry, collaborating with key players to provide some of the best storytelling within the country and internationally. And that's what it's all about. And they've grown, since those beginnings to where they are today. Over 12 years ago, I was fortunate to share Marc's story as we travelled around Asia together. We were doing a series of display lighting workshops for museum and gallery practitioners and consultants. Now, these were very engaging, highly popular, and they contributed to the success of the silicon display lighting luminaire range that became a preferred choice around Southeast Asia, in part thanks to Marc's engaging story and knowledge. So I'm very interested to see what he's got for us this afternoon. In particular, over the last year, when you add the normal challenges of everything we face to how you go about actually, setting up an experience, in a COVID environment when you have another constraint added. So without further ado, over to you, Marc.
Thanks, Phil. I gave Phil a 30-second time limit for that introduction, so it's good to see he's true to form and gone a good 5 minutes over. When this conference was confirmed online, I felt I kind of had to rescope and rewrite the presentation. I normally stand up with a whole bunch of bullet points and some pretty pictures and kind of wing it. But I had to cull it down to 45 minutes, which might be a challenge. So I'm going to have to speak pretty quickly. And I've written a lot of it. So apologies in advance if this feels a bit rote, because it kind of is. So my thinking behind this session was to plot my path from theatre lighting to architecture and back again, linking how lighting for theatre is different, but basically the same as lighting for architecture. I'll start with a quick backstory of my history, which will segue seamlessly, of course, to give you some context about where we've come from and where we are right now. I founded what was to become Toulouse in 1989 when I finished my electrical apprenticeship here in Wellington. As an electrician, wiring high-rise buildings and spending nights and weekends doing amateur theatre here in Wellington at Kandala Arts and Wellington Repertory Theatres, plus the occasional pack in or pack out at the Opera House. I struggled with the electrical and construction industries, as I still do. It was a million miles away from the people that I hung out in the theatre world. Construction workers were very challenging, always racist, sexist, and the work repetitive, generally freezing cold and somewhat boring. An important lesson I learned when I was very disillusioned with construction in the later stages of my apprenticeship was from a chum who said, look to someone doing your job who's 10 or 20 years older than yourself, and do you like what you see? And do you see yourself in that position in your future? Keep doing what you're doing, and that's where you'll end up. So obviously I didn't. My first real job in theatre was a Cliff Richard rock and roll tour at the Michael Fowler Centre at the end of my apprenticeship. Follow spot at night and the days spent spending production cash. I literally got handed wads of cash and the company car keys and got sent around Wellington to buy Cliff Richard's tennis shoes, touring paraphernalia, stage fans, stools, etc., etc. So I did that for a week, and that was a pretty amazing inroad into the world of theatre. The International Festival of the Arts in 1990 was my first big experience in the real world of hard-working lighting crew. I worked every festival of the arts in Wellington from 1990 to I think about 2004. I'll have to check with Carla. She has a greater memory of that than I do, 14 years or so. Many years and lots of real world Tetris, doing truck packs with the ballet, rock and roll load-ins, humping those lovely speakers. We used to call them Barton's bastard boxes, and all the challenges of gigging, tech, juggling AC/DC concerts at the Athletic Park when the roof blew off, slotting back in rehearsals at the Opera House, and all those things that go with it. The State Opera House, I transitioned quite quickly into the Opera House, where over the years I became the in-house casual lighting tech designer, doing a lot of dance, Footnote, Deirdre Tarrant Dance School, folk music festivals, big BB King concerts, which I think I did 2 of, and a heap of other big touring acts back in the day when the Opera House was that sort of place. Alongside the Opera House, we had recently finished the Wellington Repertory Theatre, and I was working alongside the late Ian Nichols to help wire the theatre. We worked closely to light such shows in that theatre as the New Zealand School of Dance and very many other productions. I learned a huge amount from Ian in those early days, and a lot of the skills I continued on with in life were from Ian. From those small beginnings, I began working with Ian often, moving from production to production and tea break to tea break. Gigging at the Opera House taught me very quickly about lighting for the large stage. And bizarrely, I developed in my own mind that it was entirely mine. I'm sure lots of other people did it before me, a stage 3-colour wash system. As I recall, the colours, dug them out the other day, were 142 lavender, 134 amber, and 116 peacock blue. The reason for the choice was that they blended together to become almost white light, kind of like an LED par can is these days, not really white, but it's what we perceive as white. And the ladders were in light pinks and ambers to fill in the gaps. And as much backlight as we could possibly muster from the old Strand 243s in some form of deep colour, so long as it was on for less than about 45 minutes because it would burn out. The reason for the colour palette at the time and the sticking to the colour palette was I liked colour, and those colour choices worked for almost every show in one degree or another. There was often no time between productions, so anything more than a quick regel of some downstage specials was about all we had to offer. Even as a very hard-working theatre tech, heading off to the Edinburgh Festival, working for the first time as a board operator doing comedy in a tent in the Meadows, then moving on to HOD lighting for the music hall, and then as the assembly room to overall HOD for lighting. This experience changed the whole working stage for me. Every year after returning from Edinburgh Festival, I was invited to design a higher caliber of theatre, and every year after every year, the shows got bigger. National opera companies, dance, ballet, musical theatre. Every time I came back, I seemed to be more popular. It seemed that I needed to leave New Zealand to become employable as a New Zealand lighting designer. These images here are from the NBA, New Zealand Opera's production of Carmen. Many shades of white were thrust upon me by doing a balancing work for the Royal New Zealand Ballet. These are actually images of Halo from Douglas Wright's 2000 performance. Open white and shades of CTO and CTB started to come more into my repertoire by the time I got to Douglas Wright. I recall his memorable tantrum, "This show is all fucking fucked," as he stormed out of the dress rehearsal. That made for a challenging opening day replot and dealing with the ballet out of town for the first time for me. He was not to be seen again front of house until the curtain up on opening night. Working with Douglas and his set designers and costume designers, I truly discovered how strong imagery could be delivered by the sets and costumes, and how the lighting worked as a layering and separation tool from the dancers and the striking sets behind and around them. I cut my teeth on touring with Footnote Dance Company and Paul Gendon's theatre troupe, doing Harry McCleary around the country. That's where I learned firsthand how vastly different stage sizes were in the real world. I'd spent a lot of time at the Opera House. I knew that stage intimately. And I recall Helena Keeley running from wing to wing in a heavy dog costume made out of mop heads. The Opera House, it was an easy gig for her, but performing the same choreography at the Aotea Centre resulted in many kilometres being travelled, and her often late for every single one of her cues when she finally got to the centre of the stage. Using the medium of lighting to enhance storytelling was well entrenched in my life by this stage. Sometime later, Ian Nichols was busy one week and he asked me to cover for him as a lighting designer at Te Papa. Going into the production office for the first time, meeting the head of design, we got on really well, and he had a great philosophy. If it wouldn't survive in the New York underground, it won't survive in a museum. So build it strong and build it tough, and it'll stay and work for a long time. I stayed at Te Papa as their in-house lighting designer for 4.5 years until we opened the building in February 1998. When I started, I would have run a mile if someone had told me I would end up designing every exhibition in Te Papa, alongside designing our own light fitting for manufacture here in New Zealand with Modus Lighting. I would truly have thought them crazy. The biggest lesson I took away from Te Papa were the very wise words from a very wise friend of mine now. He said to me, scale the budget to the number that works for you by removing the zeros at the end. If you're happy with $100 budget, because that's what you have in your wallet and you can manage that in your head, then make each light cost 30 cents. But don't forget to add the zeros back in at the end of the budget. Designing exhibition lighting for a national museum requiring over 3,500 purpose-built light fittings would never have been possible for me at the time if I did not take each wall or each display case as a standalone element. My takeaway was to focus on the small things that are right in front of me, and the bottom line will resolve itself. These images are from Te Horo Wales exhibition, Japanism, which was a Japanese fashion exhibition, and Gianni Versace exhibition, one of the early shows that we did at Te Papa. Te Papa is the place where I learned and honed my basic architectural lighting skills, using static lighting in the audience to generate a shimmer and movement in a scene, and theatre lighting versus artifact lighting and conservation at its height. I also learned very quickly that things like black wrap and gaffer tape have no place in a museum or an art gallery. Lights are installed into an architectural space and the light fittings themselves are part of that aesthetic. Architecture has its own language, especially when it comes to light fittings. I led every gallery and touring show for the following 10 years after opening of Te Papa. We parted company for a year or two after that time. It was time for a break. And then following that time for a break, they called me up to rebuild the Pacifica exhibition space within the museum. More recently, we completed a third attempt at the space that started life as Parade, Some of you that are old will remember the corrugated iron Holden that fronted the front of that exhibition. That space then became Life in New Zealand and is now the Toy Art Gallery, as it's shown here, top left. Top right of these images is the Tiffany Singh exhibition called Total Internal Reflection. And the bottom image here is Bug Lab, which is still touring the world on and off as we speak. Opening the new Threshold Gallery within the toy art space was Michael Parakofai's exhibition, Detour. He is a truly gifted and single-minded artist who loves to dig the knife in. Art meets architecture. In the top left image, you possibly can't see that, but can I get a mouse over there? No, anyway. On the very right-hand side of it is a very large wall element that comes into the gallery space. Michael hated that wall element. He said it was intrusive into the experience. And so he turned it into an arrow on the night before opening with a giant built segment of the wall. Basically, middle finger to the architect saying, keep your architecture out of my gallery space. Giant elephant in the room was truly giant, wobbly head monkeys, and priceless art mounted on scaffolding. In the bottom left-hand image, you'll see Colin McCann's Northern Panels. These were originally just mounted on pipe, on scaffolding, and that was it. That was the done deal. Eventually, they became covered with acrylic and a barrier was put up in front of them. Bottom right-hand image was the perfect audience member for Michael. Someone who contorts themselves to see the back of the artworks, enjoys the experience. The tiny French shop, top right, an image was fabricated in precise detail to mimic a French shop, and it was housing a significant collection item, the most important collection item in this collection from the Te Papa works called Moon Rock. It is in fact a tiny rock from the moon. It was gifted to Te Papa by President Nixon, and Michael thought it totally appropriate that you had to lie on the floor to experience the art and read the graphic panel inside the shop. This was truly Michael through and through, make them work for their art. Architecture on a larger scale, we now jump back in time to 2005 in the World Expo in Aichi, Japan. The New Zealand pavilion was called Land of the Long White Cloud. And as you walked in, there were various po that had new sea, land, and people. Creative lighting above your head and the compact fluorescents hanging on wires inside a Dacron cloud. The cloud was held together like all good things with tagging guns from the wardrobe department. And at the end of the cloud, it rained into a punamu stone. Of course, people wanted to drink the water because they thought it came from New Zealand. The punami that was rained on was found by a young Ngaitahu girl searching the waters under a rapid with her auntie in the South Island. The stone was named Matawai, meaning to look closely. It now resides at Rainbow Springs after another stint overseas with us at the World Expo in China 5 years after this one. Large-scale outdoor lighting, as some of you will know, has its own challenges, especially in 2005 when waterproof meant very expensive light fittings. I think there was about 3 city colours in the country, or lots of plastic bags and PVC tape, or it got wet and it got wet. Again, as you can see in these images, colour strongly informed my design aesthetic. I'm not a 5 shades of white or a colour correction lighting designer. I do recall working closely with Tony Rabbit at Downstage Theatre for a pack-in once, and he lit an entire production of Little Shop of Horrors in Chris James 142 Pale Violet. 98% estimated of the lights in the rig were 142, and there was some green in the mix as well. His approach astounded me and shifted my whole thinking about how light is not just colour and 30-degree optimum angles. Using direction and unexpected angles suddenly had a new energy in my brain. Back when you had to focus all the lights by hand, we did this Lord of the Rings wrap party at the Queen's Wharf Event Centre. pile of 134, 115 and a bit of blue on the white tree of Gandor to round out the end of that phase in my life where I did large scale events. This photo was borrowed from Sir Ian McKellen, who didn't have to surrender his camera at the door as we mere mortals did. This image here shows the Embassy Theatre in Wellington, the world premiere of Lord of the Rings in 2003. I seem to recall we did 3 of these experiences with giant creatures on the outside of cinemas in Wellington. The Embassy Theatre later relit the frontage of their building to mimic this look. Sadly, it's fallen into the state that most buildings do over time and no maintenance. We move now to the World Expo in Shanghai, China, May 2010. And what I bring to each of these projects is theatrical lighting. It's really in my core. It is impossible to separate lighting from who I am. It informs almost every conversation I have with designers, architects, and clients. This expo had 73 million visitors, many of which were bussed in from 3 or 4 days travel away to keep the numbers up, so they bet or succeeded in their 73 million visitor number hierarchy. They were the greatest number of visitors in any expo before them. The New Zealand Pavilion was sketched on a meeting room table for its shape and form at the first session of the big design team. And it was post-rationalized to mean mountains to sea. Left-hand end is the mountains, right-hand end is the sea. The architects were sent away with the engineers on a number of occasions to try harder with the canopy poles, and they eventually came up with this amazing and crazy teeth kind of approach to the canopy. We crammed a lot into each of these expos, previous one in Japan and this one. Giant monitors on huge Po, little D&B line array sitting at the back of this shot over a kapa haka stage, and outdoor pars again were a thing that was just becoming a possibility at the time. On the right-hand side of this image at the front is what they ended up putting in front of all the pavilions to block the audience swarming them. It was a big tail race. Sadly, they stayed there right until the very end, and we never got any other photos of the building in that form. The VIP entrance at the rear of the building. This photo was taken from a giant walkway that you could walk around the entire site. The building behind its fins is enveloped in a giant forest canvas. Lighting that over such a huge building was always a challenge for us, and we did trials and tests here and eventually shipped light fittings from New Zealand to China, little coals to Newcastle, to light the building. The VIP spaces inside all the pavilions house offices, meeting rooms, cocktail function spaces, all architectural and beautifully lit, of course. The rooftop story was truly mountains to sea. Rotorua geysers at the top end, pasture lands with real grass. We wanted sheep. We were thought about bringing sheep over from New Zealand to actually graze on some of this grass, but we were thwarted at the last minute. And of course, the giant Pahudikawa tree. A lot of the things in the pavilion were borrowed from by the audience as mementos. None so grand as the giant Pahudikawa tree that sat at the base of the rooftop. This tree was manufactured here in Wellington at the old Ford factory by a bunch of film crew. Each segment of bark was cast from an actual Pahudikawa tree, then stitched and glued together as they do now very commonly to form a very believable visual, which took a lot of close inspection to find the joins. The red flowers and green leaves came in bunches and then were hot glued onto the branches. Sadly, a lot of them were stolen very early on. Parents lifted their children up to nick the branches and the flowers off the trees because they thought they were real. And the other thing that happened halfway through that experience was that all the leaves and flowers had faded from the acid rain. So they were all replaced with new ones. Carter Observatory, now called Space Place in Wellington. Jumping around a bit, backlighting of graphics was my go-to design decision whenever a darkened space and theatrical space was required. Everything looks so much better when coming out of black when you're aiming for a very theatrical look. Remembering this was pre-LED, so the walls of light were and still are today fluorescent fluorescent tubes on dimmable ballasts. Zealandia was opened within weeks of Carter Observatory and the World Expo, in 3 major life-changing experiences all at the same time seemed to be the norm for Toulouse. Strange how things run in threes and how often things repeat themselves. Rotorua Museum opened in 2011, another significant project from Toulouse. Sadly, it's now closed, as the left-hand end of this image is the old building and it fell off its piles in the Kaikoura earthquake. The Pātaka Food Storage Hut in Rotorua. This image I brought up to show colour temperature as being one of the most important aspects of the museum and gallery lighting palette. So different to my colourful past, present and future when I get a chance to be theatrical, but seldom in a museum environment do we get to do what we did in Rotorua. The designer asked specifically for a dawn to day to night image behind the waka, and the sequence on a static graphic was done as all things were at that time by silicon profiles and old-fashioned dimmers and things like that. This waka in the foreground was routed out of 40mm acrylic, bonded together and became a taonga in its own right, and lit obviously beautifully in the process. Come on. Large-scale events, sometimes just too big to turn down, as was the Rugby World Cup, was one of those for us in Auckland. The party zone in downtown Auckland at the newly completed Cloud, and we supported the event. Unfortunately, we didn't get to light the Cloud itself. That was done by an engineer, and as you will attest to it now, it's pretty patchy. Never was a great looking lighting solution. Some of our scale of installations have been magnificent over many, many years. The Festival of Light in New Plymouth. We're into our 9th year this year as the lighting designers for the festival. This image top left shows Poets Bridge, where we built a tunnel of light, which survived on the bridge for 4 years. Top right, 90s Cube is a disco cube that has traveled New Zealand to many, many light festivals and has a few more to do in its time. Over the years, we built a range of physical elements that fundamentally are about light, but are playful and inspire people to have fun. In San Francisco, 2013, we traveled there on the behalf of the New Zealand government for the 34th America's Cup, combining my love of sailing and all things great working for the New Zealand government. If this event had not been green-lit, there probably would not be a Toulouse as we know it now. There would have been an electrician, myself, working from a couple of containers out of a garage, maybe with an apprentice or two in a van. This project was for us the ambulance at the very bottom of a very long cliff we fell off after the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Not unlike 2020 with COVID, we had a very big profitable projects throughout the GFC, but 2 years later, we stopped with a halt. And for 3 years after that, our mortgage climbed $300,000 odd a year as we kept pitching for work. Luckily for us, Bryony Ellis wanted a theatrical experience as a waharoa into the hosting space for the America's Cup. Yep, sorry. And she realized that theatre people would be the only people who could pull this off at very short notice and with no actual plans of the inside of the giant waka that we could go from. Project was one of our first combining projection and lighting on the same surface, and quotes from famous New Zealanders like Brett McKenzie, what it's like to be a Kiwi flowed across the sails like weather patterns. Jumping to Queensland, Chappaqua Aboriginal Cultural Park in Queensland. Sadly, this closed from COVID, never to be reopened again. The right-hand image in this shot, the people are the land and the land is the people. faces of the people ebb and flow out of the graphic panel, telling the story that the people are always the land and the land is always the people. Unfortunately, at the time, UV light fittings and white light fittings didn't come in easily affordable linear form. So we built our own light boxes, one UV tube, one fluorescent tube, dimmable ballasts. Another go-to tool that was a strong focus in the early years of my transition from theatre to architecture was using static, textured and patterned light and the audience to generate a shimmer and movement in the scene. In theatre, we would add an animation wheel to generate the movement, but in architecture, you have a moving audience walking through a space, which does a very similar thing. I'll just skip that one. Gallipoli, the scale of our war, working with Richard Taylor at Weta Workshop and the Te Papa team. The film process versus theatre process versus architectural process was at times, as you could imagine, very challenging. Richard's process was historically the big film truck, dozens of people, millions of dollars worth of equipment, setting it up, moving it around to get the big shot. With architectural lighting, we have to design and pre-order hardware, making tough calls many months in advance with fixed budgets and an actual opening day, as opposed to we'll just shoot that again tomorrow. The lighting setup for the giants in each of the rooms was set up by myself in a form that best described and illuminated each of the characters. And then Richard would come in and we would gradually move the lights all the way around the room to getting back to the point where we started from. And then he would agree, owning that experience and realizing that we had started where we always ended up with. Lottie, the nurse on the left-hand side of this image, was one of the most challenging spaces to light for me. Dealing with the raw emotion and the storytelling that goes with each of the giant people meant for some quiet time and solitude to absorb their stories. And then after that, I would find myself never reading another graphic and turning off the soundtracks until we had finished the experience. Color temperature within the Gallipoli experience was an important part of the subtleties and the process of transitioning your audience from a normally lit scene into what would have been in theatre a rich orange or amber, but in a museum environment is very subtle manipulation of mood and energy as you move from space to space. Dunn, who's the character on the top left, in this shot probably on your screen looks very, very, very amber. In reality, he's just slightly warmer than normal light. He's covered in hot flies, he has sweat dripping off his face, and very much evokes the warm environment that he is in. And the gunners on the right, again, depending on the quality of your screen, you'll be able to see they're very coolly lit with subtle rim lighting, backlighting in sort of a lavendery color to fill in the shadows. Shadows on the top right-hand side in this miniature model were very challenging, as you can imagine. The bunkers are very deep and we had no way of lighting into them with white light because then they wouldn't be black, wouldn't represent what they were supposed to look like. So we used a rich blue from a different angle to light into those experiences. And even in the bowels of war, there's a space for some theatre. Just to the right of the cat on this latrine is the latrine. Had to be painted 4 or 5 times to reduce the realistic nature of the content in that space. Moving on to more recent productions for Toulouse was the Dark Sky experience in Takapo. The space is used more often now as a nighttime tour when the clouds block the night sky at the Mount John Observatory tours and they're brought inside. But it was originally envisaged a few years ago and open to the public as a visitor attraction. But at the moment, due to COVID and lack of tourists, it's usually only operating at night. Ngāi Tahu realized very early on, Ngāi Tahu Tourism realized very early on that an audience-facing host was the most important thing in a visitor attraction. So for all of the shows that we do work with Ngāi Tahu, it's about delivering a host, public-facing, telling stories. There's globes on the left, a giant fiberglass balls painted to look like what they do look like, but with additional red, green, blue LEDs inside, pulsing and rippling on the surface of the LEDs. The great thing about these globes, if you make it to Takapo, is that you touch them, and inside the frame structure is a subsonic transducer, and the whole thing vibrates into what is described as the sound that has been collected in space from each of the stars. This is one of the first installations where we took control of the whole experience, from master control system, host, remotes, video, lighting, and audio. There's a giant curved projection wall, which seems to have become our go-to thing in the last few years. And then the floor with the eels has a Māori proverb, was look down to see up. So you look into the puddle to see into the night sky to see the clouds. Subsequently for Toulouse, to fill in the gaps between lighting shows, we've developed a bunch of other technology, including SignSync, which is a digital signage platform, which is used around the country in many forms, dry cleaners to galleries and museums. Traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM for short, was a project we are still working on in Guangdong, China. Guangdong is a city in southern China, intended to be capturing 30 million people within the next 10 years. And it's catering to the cleaners and service workers that come over from Hong Kong and Macau. 45 minutes by bus across the ocean brings you to this city that is currently under construction. Each of the developers that gets to develop a city block have to build a social space based on the percentage of their building or floor area. So they're building parks, galleries, cinemas, museums, etc. The building is a giant flower or petal when viewed from above. The windows are painted white at the moment to reduce the thermal loading in summer, but will eventually be cleaned off, sadly. It's being completed in our absence, as we aren't allowed to travel uninoculated to China. In Wellington, we built and created 9 tableaus for the TCM experience. We did all these in Miramar in sheds, and we lit them all in the form that we were going to light them again in China. This is the story of a tiger and his carer. The tiger's carer is reaching into the tiger's mouth to pull out a bone that has been wedged into his mouth. The steel ring is on his hand in case the tiger decides to clamp down and bite the trainer or owner, whatever you want to call them. The theory is that the traditional Chinese medicine stops the tiger from biting the man. The right image here is Ben Barord, the exhibition designer, to give you a scale. We decided very early on when working with these giant tableaus to use a PAR 16, a very cheap and available light fitting with the Philips MR16 LED lamp and dichroic color. The reason for that was so we could find the same light fittings in China and guarantee the beam angle and the color temperature and the experience and the lighting cues would be the same in all instances. The level of detail in these giant figures is quite astounding. These images I've just brought to you as a close-up of the chap lying down who is handing a mushroom to the guy on the right. 2 different tableaus set up and lit. They were truly massive. Unfortunately, as I said, they're being installed and lit in our absence in China as we speak. Like many, 2020 was a year that was almost the end of Toulouse again, or 2021. The team at Toulouse started lockdown with 2 solid projects and 1 possible likely project. Project 1 was Mania, Footprints of Coupe. They closed their borders approximately 4 weeks before lockdown, cancelling all site visits, and the doors were locked with no date for finishing the building or when we might start the fit out. Project 2 was the All Blacks experience. Ngāi Tahu Tourism closed their doors, or Ngāi Tahu fired all of the Ngāi Tahu Tourism staff and shut it, again, with no expectation of it reopening. And our third project, that was a strong probability during the beginning of lockdown in 2020. They sent artists home from Weta with boxes of paint and modelling clay to keep working, but there was no possibility that Weta Unleashed would rise from the ashes. For us, the All Blacks experience, which opened in December last year, 1,800 square metres at Sky City, Auckland, is a very significant project for us. Even though I don't really do rugby, it is still a significant national project of importance for us. It was envisaged as a very architectural space by the designers Workshop E. Black on black was the colour scheme. It is linear and very streamlined. That image on the right is the Māori stone sitting on a plinth. It's just headed off travelling around the world for its next stint with the All Blacks, I believe. The storytelling aspects of this show is performed by the hosts acting out the script, telling them the stories that they have gleaned firsthand from a bunch of the old guard rugby players who came through the experience as we built the All Blacks experience. The dressing room lighting is very architectural. The right-hand side of the room in that image is very well lit. The left-hand side of the room is not very well lit because of the way that it was designed. But again, we plunged the space into darkness. We light it up. It's bright enough for photos to be taken for the exit at the gift shop. And it's a very, very personal storytelling experience. When you're sitting in your booth, your light fades down and then you have a rugby player telling you all about their special underpants they have to wear for every game or some such story. Top left in this shot is an image of the welcome experience. The projected walls and ceilings start off as an image of a 1970s, 1980s rugby club, and they morph into telling the story of grassroots New Zealand rugby. A very punchy soundtrack and some very, very cool Axminster carpet on the floor. Apparently it's still made in some form. Basic lighting in this experience was tin hats on wires like a rugby club and a bit of health and safety lighting under the seats and some steps for getting out. Top right is the Haka experience, which is 3 projections on a giant curved screen and a massive soundtrack with huge Twin 18 subs, massive SPL, and the Haka itself, whole body physical experience as it runs during that space. And the bottom experience is the first of the game rooms. This one's called Step Up, 26 touchscreens because there's 26 audience members, large monitors in a very stylized space. The lighting in the ceiling is as if it's mirrored off the pitch. The lights match the lines on a rugby field. They change colour, red for under pressure, loud noises and high intensity game. They go blue for the red head, blue head storytelling game. And they tell lots of other stories in between. Success and failure, everything changes colour in the space, the only space in the building that there is any colour at all. Step Up is the last of the All Blacks experience spaces. It's like a giant time zone. Unfortunately, it's just black on black with white light, not like time zone with lots of colour. Big 5 metre tall projection screens for kicking and passing games, floor projections for games of running and agility, kicking and throwing balls around. The only object in the entire experience is one display case in the far right hand image of this slide, and that houses the originals jersey, the very first rugby jersey, Jonah Lomu's jersey, and a Black Ferns jersey, and of course you exit through the gift shop. Weta Unleashed in all its forms is an amazing experience. I will whiz through these images because a lot of you that are in Auckland will get to see it at some point in your life. But it forms many layers, many rooms, many genres, and the creative process and generating it was an amazing experience working with Weta as well. One of the things I discovered was that not all UV lights are created equal. The wildfire paint only works at a certain nanometer frequency, which apparently the Show Pro UV PARs don't operate in that frequency. So there's a lot of learnings that are still going on all these 30 or 40, 35 years later for me. The end of the experience, giant robots, giant spaceships, very theatrical, fruit salad, large scale. Yeah. Mania, Footprints of Coupe, from one extreme to the other. Mania was another significant experience for the Toulouse team. Our project folder for this experience is dated 2014, so it's had 6 years in development. These carvings are lit up at night in the park. Unfortunately, we haven't been back when the trees have grown to get some decent photos, but we will in the fullness of time. Standing up a 60-seat 4D theatre in the year that was 2020 was it was quite a remarkable achievement. There's special effects, huge subs under the seat that vibrate the setting block, leg ticklers, water sprays, misting, smell of rotten burning wood and rotten fish, smoke overhead in stage, and the whole thing is run with no staff, no hosts, just the hosts. The performers are mic'd, they hit their marks every time, and they have the ultimate backing track of 5 giant projection screens behind them and a thumping film score that they have to work to. As I said, there's no technician in this space, there's a gardener and the performers. So they start with the iPad every morning, they go through the startup sequences, make sure everything's working, hit the go button at the beginning of the show, and they have no choice but to hit their marks and get the show to its end. In conclusion, seeing my world through light has been a true gift to me. This is an image of Bug Lab, as you can tell, back to my politely called fruit salad lighting style. It's still touring the world, Bug Lab. It's still traveling around. They do it remotely at the moment in America, but hopefully any day soon we'll all get to travel back around. It is just like a theatre show. There's a lighting plan, there's focus notes. Unfortunately, there's no stage managers and no lighting operators. Zealandia, like so many of our experiences built over the years, are all linked in some way to lighting. Whilst a lot of them are screen-based and video-based, there's always a lighting element from Toulouse helping to tell that story. Lighting is such a life force for me, and I often miss the black box that is theatre, but I then remember the buildings, the van, the 7 staff and their families, and how important it is for us to keep Toulouse alive in some way, shape or form. And if you look at what we do from a slightly different angle, possibly through some 142 gel, it's not so different from the black box form of theatre. Some fun little photos from stormtroopers lining a street in China, just round from the TCM Museum. And the final photo I have of one of the giants in the TCM Museum. And of course, there's always health and safety when it comes to China. It's a safety net over a hole that drops 6 floors to the concrete below. That's me, Phil. Thank you all very much for listening and being here at the ETNZ experience. Not quite sure what happens now.
That's well, thank you very much for that, Mark. That's a fascinating insight. I'm only regretful of the fact that I ran on for a little bit too long, and you know, we don't have.
Well, 4 minutes late, mate. You started 4 minutes late, so you know I would have hit on the right time.
Oh yes, please do not hold Mark to account for that. It's yours truly. Yeah, no, that's absolutely, you know, it's been a privilege to sit in on that. Thanks very much. And thanks to all the attendees, and in particular, join me in thanking Mark for his sharing of experiences. Thank you very, very much. And yeah, it's been really good to observe that. Thanks once again. And look forward to one day to congratulating you in person again. So,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the beer you owe me.
more than that. Thank you. All right. And thank you, everyone.